All right, well, we can go ahead and get started. Thanks for having this talk with me. This will be fun. I actually remember the way that I discovered you and your work was I think my friend sent me a video and he said, "Dude, watch this debate." I was like, "Okay, let's watch it." We were both really big into policy and debate, and it was an appearance of you on Tucker Carlson, actually. And it was like about a 10-minute exchange. And suffice to say, we thought you did pretty well in that debate. So every now and then I look up, about once a year, I'll look up Alex Narasta debate, and I'll just get a good fill of immigration style debates, and that can be really fun for me. My political perspective, I'm definitely on the left. I'm not a libertarian, but obviously, where people on the left and libertarians tend to agree is a bit more of a liberal immigration scheme. And so I figured we could get into that and maybe a little bit more expansive than immigration from there in this hour or two. And just go from there. If you want, you can start out, just introduce yourself. People might not be familiar with your work, and we can go from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks a bunch for having me. So my name's Alex Narasta. I'm the director of economic and social policy studies at the Cato Institute. But my primary focus for policy research has been immigration. I've been working on immigration policy since about 2007 um, at various places in Washington, D.C. And so my current job is I work at the Cato Institute. And for people who aren't familiar, it's a think tank in Washington, D.C. I think you mentioned it's a libertarian think tank where I do mostly research related to immigration policy, the economics, sociology, crime, national security implications. And I argue for a more open and expansive legal immigration system.
And what's your educational background?
So I got my undergrad in economics from George Mason, and then my master's in economic history from the London School of Economics.
All right. So now people know who we're dealing with. Okay. This is a very credentialed person. From I've tried to make it clear that at least in terms of discussing economics with people, you don't always have to be very credentialed. But it's nice if you are, obviously, you've got that sort of training and whatnot. But
It
all right. Well,
signals, it signals, it signals well.
it
We'll see
does.
if I know what I'm talking about, right?
It does tend to signal well. I agree. It does definitely depend though. As I'm sure you'd also agree. But at the end of the day, just let the at the end of a conversation, you'll know if somebody knows what they're talking about, right? They don't have to tell you what degrees they have. But it's good to know. Um, so I remember you once said, and this was one of the most. It struck me as one of the most stunning facts that I think I had heard, because you never hear about this in school, and you certainly never hear about it from the average conservative, that the founding fathers were open border guys. And I think that in a discussion that you were having with a more anti-immigration person, can't recall the guy's name, I think you said something like, the US didn't have a single law restricting the flow of movement of people until like the 1800s. What is the exact year that we had, and what was the first immigration law that we ended up enacting?
So the first law the federal government enacted was in 1875, and that is, almost 100 years after the Constitution went into effect, about 80 some years after it went into effect. And that law restricted the movement of people who were criminals, who were insane at the time, like what they would call insane or crazy, sick, obviously sick, and specifically prostitutes, which was just sort of a backdoor way for them to bar single Chinese women at the time. It was sort of, that's the way they wrote it into the statute, was prostitutes, but they're really targeting single women from China who were coming here to join their husbands who had come before them. Prior to that, there were no federal restrictions at all on the movement of people to the United States. Now, some states had different rules for instance. So, like, if you went to New York State, they had an island set up. Castle Island is what it was called. If you were sick, they would quarantine you there for a bit of time until you became healthy. If you were sort of insane or had some other problems, they try to push you to another state and do some other sort of nasty things like that. And a handful of times every once in a while, they would send somebody back to Europe, primarily where they came from at the time. But generally, you could land anywhere in the United States, and with basically no exceptions or very few exceptions, you would be able to enter the United States.
Okay, and so this brings me to something that I feel like I've struggled with somewhat, but I don't really think it's that hard to think about. Perhaps you have an easier way of explaining it, but I think a natural response to this was it could be, well, the U.S. wasn't a superpower, right? We weren't the top of the hill. We weren't an economic powerhouse back then, right? We wouldn't have risked, mass immigration, and clearly we didn't by having open borders. However, given our welfare state and given the welfare states of many other developed nations, we couldn't possibly have open borders or a more liberal immigration scheme such as the one you describe, because everyone would just come here. We'd be flooded, right? What's your response to that? Because the truth is, I think that people can look at the examples of Germany and Sweden and these recent immigration shocks and say, hey, there have definitely been some cohesion problems here. There have definitely been some economic problems here, at least in the short term. What's your response to those empirical examples as a way to justify a more immigration skeptic stance?
So I don't think the examples of Sweden and Germany are quite comparable to the United States for a number of reasons. One is the history of the United States. We have a culture that's very geared toward accepting and trying to assimilate people from various backgrounds, right? So in the United States, if somebody has a background where they're, say, just to pick one out of a hat, right, like Mexican background, and they claim to be Mexican and not American, the response from a lot of Americans is to be kind of offended and to say, no, no, you're an American. If you go to Norway, for instance, where I have first cousins once removed who are living there, who are half Iranian and half Norwegian, they say the Norwegian, and Norwegians correct them and say, no, you're something else. You're Middle Eastern, you're this or the that. So I think in terms of cohesion and in terms of integration, the U.S. does much better at integrating people culturally, because what it means to be an American is not really an ethnic identification like it is in a lot of European nation states. But it's more of a sort of you respect the sort of authority of the Constitution. You're broadly, fairly broadly tolerant with some variation, and basically speak English. Those are basically the identifications that people really
Well,
take up.
what about when people say, well, what about people that don't have that respect? They'll fearmonger. They'll say, oh, what about these Muslim immigrants that don't
Yeah,
respect the Constitution or liberal ideology, right? Of course, forget about the fact that cities like Dearborn, Michigan exist, right? But let's just
yeah.
say that doesn't exist. What's your response to the more racialized or cultural arguments against mass immigration?
So amongst like the sort of the cultural arguments, I guess I'll focus on the Muslim one. What I say is just take a look at the polling of Muslim Americans and recent immigrants and compare it to people, in the Muslim world. The differences are vast. Basically, Muslims polled in the United States today had the opinions of Americans around the year like 2008. Um, I mean, yeah, a little bit more conservative, but by no means like supportive of like a caliphate
Right.
type of situation, right? Or something going on, or
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia or something like that. And part of this is, and this is something that I think is pretty fundamental to understanding immigration, is that it's not a random sample of people from these countries who come here. It's a self-selection, right? It's people who are probably a little bit less nationalistic, a little bit less chauvinistic, a little bit more open to new experiences, people open to being around a culture that's different than them, and people who are a little bit more ambitious and upwardly mobile and are fine from being away from sort of their cultural comfort zones, right? So it's not like we're getting sort of the average Saudi, right? But we're getting sort of a person from Saudi Arabia who is fairly different from what a lot of other Saudis are, and that's something that's been pretty constant throughout U.S. history, whether you're talking about Italians or Germans or others.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I would largely agree. Obviously, if Muslims were truly regressive in terms of their social views, why do 2/3 of them vote for Democrats? That doesn't make any sense, right? Why is you know why is the city of Dearborn not under Sharia law right now? That doesn't make any sense either. It's the most Muslim city in the whole country. It's a majority Muslim city. The most Sharia you're ever going to find in Dearborn is that they don't serve pork in their school district. Wow, that's imagine what a totalitarian place Dearborn, Michigan is, right? That's a little ridiculous. But I would
It
agree
is.
with that. Yeah.
And the thing is, a lot of these discussions, what a lot of people do is they sort of like combine what happens in Europe with what happens in the United States. And I would say there are definitely some differences between the two. But the third, fourth generation Muslim immigrants, the descendants of Muslim immigrants in European countries, pretty secular in their outlook, pretty Europeanized, um, speak European languages, educated, have the low birth rates like the rest of like the rest of that sort of overwhelmingly secular continent.
Mhm.
So it's not something. One of the things we forget, right, with American history is we learn about, say, the problems with the Irish in the mid 19th century in school. And then we flip a few pages in our history book, we go to 1950 and we're like, oh, yeah, everything was fine. But we forgot like the 100 years in there where people thought the United States was going to hell. And these Irish were not going to assimilate and they were going to turn us into a Catholic theocracy. And we forget about all these problems. But in the end, it turns out usually pretty well. And it's turned out well historically, and it seems to be, at least all the evidence that we have right now, is it's turning out fine with Muslims and other immigrants from places around the world that are a little less
Mhm.
liberal than we may like.
What do you think of policies like the Danish government, where it seems like they're attempting to accelerate the assimilation process by like making immigrants send their kids to like special courses? I think there's a rule where like if you want to be in public housing, you can't be in a public housing unit that's more than like 30% Arab because they want to get rid of cultural enclaves. What are your thoughts about policies like that? Since you did mention that European countries seem
Yeah.
to distinctly have problems assimilating immigrants.
I mean, some of the other Danish policies, right, are the making migrants give up or especially refugees and asylum seekers, give up their jewelry and goods to the government, and basically deporting a lot of refugees back to their home countries. Like this, the Danish government is quite brutal when it
Yeah,
comes to immigration. On the
yeah.
assimilation side, they are trying a lot of these assimilationist policies. I have no confidence that they will work. Um, the United States, amongst all developed countries, has the fewest assimilation policies. Seems to work out the best, and I'm just have no confidence that the Danish government, which is not an immigrant society, which has no experience with immigration, will be able to design a set of public policies to speed that along very rapidly. I think the best thing they can do, and Denmark actually does have this pretty well, is to make it easier for people who are lower skilled to get jobs very rapidly and easily in the labor market so that they can start earning an income and start culturally assimilating a little bit, because a lot of cultural assimilation happens through working and through just interacting normally with locals, and they seem to be doing that way. So they might succeed sort of unintentionally by the fact that they have relatively liberal employment policies for Europe.
Do you think that there's any reason to take seriously, though, cultural enclaves in the context of an immigration shock, right? So, for instance, right, when you see videos of news reporters in Sweden getting harassed by like a bunch of Somali immigrants that clearly have some sort of aversion to outsiders, but they have this cultural enclave, it's only natural for people to say, like, oh, that might be a problem because it's clear that they have a starkly different culture. It's a cultural enclave that's different from broader society to the extent that they're harassing, the native population to some extent, right? People might point out, the rates at which women go to work and it's so much
Hmm.
lower. They have
Hmm.
a lot less secular views. So is that actually a problem? Is it overblown? Is it sensationalized? If it is a problem, what do you do about it from a policy perspective?
So the problem is exaggerated, but it is real. So the labor force participation rates for Somalis, for instance, in Sweden is much lower than it is for native-born ethnic Swedes. Of course, what's one of the issues, and Somalis are generally sort of the lowest skilled immigrants to the Western world, lowest levels of education and skills, etc. But what's interesting is a lot of higher skilled immigrants to Sweden who come as refugees, like a lot of Iranians, for instance, have labor market outcomes almost exactly the same as Somalis, and lived in enclaves for a while too. And so part of the reason explanation for that, I think, is partly, cultural differences. I think you could definitely make that argument, but a lot of it is also a lot of really bad Swedish policy that unintentionally separates people and segregates people into these enclaves. So you have a lot of the basically in Sweden for asylum seekers, it's mostly illegal for them to work for the first year to 2 years that they are in the country. They have to attend classes and Swedish classes and other types of classes to assimilate. And then when they are able to work, because of the way that the Swedish labor market is regulated, it's generally just more difficult for lower skilled people to get started in the labor market. Now, the Swedish government has been trying to make some changes over the last 20 years, but has made fairly little headway. So the number one thing that I would do in places, well, in everywhere pretty much, if you're concerned about immigrant integration and assimilation, is to make it easier for them to enter the labor market. With that comes confidence. With that comes the ability to support yourself and your family, and it fosters interaction, between the immigrant group and the majority population, and between different immigrant group, and teaches the nice skill that you need to really get ahead. So that would be my number one recommendation for all these places. And we see this in the United States too, when we compare refugee populations in different states, because there's fairly different rules about welfare access, means-tested welfare benefit access, and on the American state level, which does have an impact on whether they enter the labor market. And there does seem to be fairly different outcomes, even when you control for national origin in terms of confidence and assimilation and whether they consider themselves to be American. So I take some of those lessons over to Sweden.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I've read that some of the things worth praising in terms of the Nordic models and how they deal with immigrants is their active labor market policies, right? So you do qualify, you're not destitute basically financially if you're unable to find employment in Nordic countries, but at the same time, the one detriment that unions can have in terms of society and cohesion is labor outcomes, right? It makes the labor market a bit tighter, right? It's a little bit harder to get a job because unions have an in-group preference, perfectly rational for them to have that preference. But if you want to take advantage economically of immigration, it makes some sense to have some schemes for immigrants to get employment at perhaps outside of unionization, or have some law that says that, you cannot have some sort of in-group, out-group preference. If you're allowing people to, if you're not throwing them out and you're allowing them to stay, you should create structures that encourage them to get employment as fast as you can. I guess that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a path to self-sufficiency, as well as just confidence and feeling like a place is home. And a lot of these disagreements in Northern Europe, et cetera, about immigration are about these people who are, multiple generations living there, and they don't feel like it's their home country. I mean, I just saw a poll out of Sweden the other day where the Swedish Democratic Party, Sweden Democrats, who are sort of the far right-wing nationalist nativist party, a majority of union voters in Sweden now support them over the Social Democratic Party. And part of that is because of the anti-immigration views. So what you talked about with the union issues and the union politics, this is something we see in a number of countries. And we don't really see it in the US for weird reasons that are quite unique to the United States, but we used to see it here. So that's just a different angle. You've got large groups in these countries of natives who have a vested interest in preventing some of these labor market liberalizations. And that's pretty hard to fight against politically.
Yeah, that's fair. I do understand that point of view. And I'd largely agree. I mean, even as a leftist, or someone who's on the left, I wouldn't consider myself a socialist, but from that perspective, it is a difficult balance to strike where you want unionization, you want collective bargaining. If anything, from a libertarian perspective, free market deciding, workers coming together, pooling
Hmm. Hmm.
their
Hmm.
pulling their negotiating power. There's nothing wrong with that in a libertarian framework. You want that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But balancing that with, good outcomes for immigrants can be a little bit difficult. I agree with you there. What do you think in regard to the issue of union density immigration? I mean, what's something specifically that you could imagine? Something, other than just like, well, make it easier for them to get jobs, but like, what's a specific policy that you've seen that's worked out favorably in this regard?
So there's a paper in the American Economic Review about comparing refugees in Switzerland. So Switzerland, the Swiss cantons, it's a highly federalized system, and Swiss cantons allow um, refugees and asylum seekers to work at different times. So some of them say you have to get a job right away. Others say you can't work for several years. Others say you have to take a bunch of classes before you can get a job. And there's numerous findings in this wonderful paper, but the big one is that just letting them work legally off the bat seems to have the biggest impact in terms of reducing their crime rates, getting them to
Yeah.
feeling like they're Swiss and everything like that. So I'd say the easiest thing to do is for European countries, and not every European country has these laws, but most of them do, just saying asylum seekers, as soon as they arrive, they can get a job
Yeah.
without changing any other laws or anything else like that. Just allow them to work. And then in addition to that, I would try to liberalize labor market rules, especially for lower end workers. So making it easier to both fire and hire lower end workers, sort of, following on the work by Justin Wolfers about how making it difficult to fire workers, of course, makes it difficult to hire them. So reforming some of those rules, especially on the lower end, I think are more important probably than dealing with a lot of these unionization issues. I mean, a lot of unions in these countries are sort of mid to higher skilled workers, especially in a lot of like industrial and transportation occupations and other sort of high end service occupations. And a lot of immigrants are just not going to be competing with those workers to begin with due to different skills. So that's those are some of the primary things that I would do specifically on that. But one thing, and I guess I'm previewing this, but I got a paper that we just got to revise and resubmit from the European Economic Review, looking at the impact of immigration on union density in the United States historically, and trying to estimate the impact of immigrants on unionization. What we find is that immigrants can explain about a third of the decline in unionization in the US from 1980 to 2020. And so, even if workers aren't directly competing with a lot of immigrant workers, with a lot of unionized workers, I think there is a large fear amongst unions, probably rational fear, frankly, that immigration will undermine some of their positions.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, why does why does immigration cause union density to decrease? I assume it's because I guess they're just easier to hire. They're more expendable workers, I guess, so corporations might be more likely to hire them. I mean, what's the link there?
So the link is so unions, just like firms, right? Unions have a birth rate and a death rate, just like new firms. And what we find is, and this is fairly common actually in the labor literature, is that when locations are more diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, linguistically, it raises the transaction cost of forming a union. So what happens is basically it's not like immigration kills unions, but what it does is makes it union formation much more difficult by raising those transaction costs because it's a collective action problem forming a union. And just everything that sort of raises those costs makes it more difficult to form. So that's basically what we find too, is in places where immigrants come from different backgrounds to a location, unions have a much more difficult time forming. And this doesn't affect government unions, by the way. Those are fairly stable over time, public sector unions. but it really crushes private sector unions, or makes it more difficult for them to form. And then just a normal sort of attrition rate of unions basically results in lower union density over time.
That's interesting. Okay. Um, all right, that makes sense. That's really interesting. And I guess piggybacking
But it's
off of
something. Sorry. It's something that I say to my conservative friends, right? So I have my conservative friends. They're like, "Oh, diversity. Who cares? Like, what's the good part about diversity? Diversity is the strength." They laugh about that. I'm like, well, if I'm going to play, the part of a conservative and make this argument to you, it does tend to decrease unionization over time. And I thought conservatives are pretty skeptical of unions. And I just like to poke at them, right, on these types of issues, because it's not going to change their mind. I don't think conservatives are anti-immigration for any like reason that makes any sense. But I like to point that out to them, to the Thomas Sowells of the world, that from their perspective, there actually kind of is more of a benefit than they realize potentially.
well, yeah, I think it was well, I think it was Reagan that said immigrants are Republicans, they just don't know it yet, or something like that. And
Hispanics specifically, yeah.
oh, okay, I see. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think, yeah, I think politically, it's there's conspiracies out there that try to make the claim that like, oh, you just want these mass immigration policies because they all vote for Democrats, and it's like I don't think that's really true over the long term, and it's not true over the short term because they can't vote in the short term, right? So, unless you're of the view that well, they actually are voting, which is an even crazier thing to believe in, obviously. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about in this last, sort of half hour, we're going to go back to immigration because I forgot to bring it up in the first place. Was an argument that I got into with another online sort of content creator was about immigration. And he was making the argument that immigration is an unsustainable way to increase economic growth, right? So why does immigration increase economic growth, for the audience? Well, the answer is that it's a factor of production, right? It's labor. You need three things to grow an economy: labor, capital, technology. Labor is one of those things. Immigrants are laborers, right, for the most part. And so that's why immigration grows an economy, right? Why does that help developing countries? Well, it's because their birth rates are declining, right? And immigrants come in, they typically have higher birth rates, and also they're just people, they're younger. And my argument is that the U.S. economy, I think long term, will be more robust than the Chinese economy, almost purely because of our immigration policy. And so his argument, however, was that, well, birth rates are decreasing across the globe, right? How long can you really depend on immigration as a means by which to get young workers when birth rates across the entire world are decreasing, right? What happens in a world where birth rates in every country are decreasing, where even immigrant populations coming over doesn't increase the birth rates? What do you do in that scenario? What happens to the economy? Is the answer actually still immigration? What's your response to that type of argument?
Well, immigration is not an answer to every economic problem, right? I work in immigration policy, but it's not an answer to everything. But even in a world where birth rates are crashing, and they are crashing just about everywhere, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa are the exception. Even then, you will still have large generational cohorts of people who are in the migration age of where they will seek to emigrate, and you do have some poorer regions of the world, right? So even if the birth rate in Central America drops to below replacement, you're still going to have a large generation of people due to in sort of the coming ages who can immigrate to the United States. So it's a lot longer perspective than I think he makes it out, right? Like lower birth rates today does not translate to a shrinking population for a long time. And even if the cohort of people in a certain age range who could emigrate is going to grow less slowly or is going to shrink, you're still talking about a large pool of people who would be able to move to areas around the world where they're more productive. And that's the United States, right? I mean, is one of the top ones. So it does, like, I would say the decrease in the future population of the globe is going to be bad for economic growth everywhere in the world, because there's fewer factors of production, in the same way that if you destroyed half of the machines in the world, it'd be really bad for economic growth too. But the fact, but we have a lot more sort of we can still get a lot of those people to come to the most productive places. There are still billions of people who are not in the most productive places of the world. So there's a lot more scope for growth than I think your friend lets on.
Well, I think that that naturally leads to two responses, and I'm curious to hear your answers. So, um, the first response is, well, now you're just importing people that aren't actually going to be long term beneficial to the economy because they're not having kids, right? Because eventually these immigrant populations might not even have birth rates that would replace themselves, right? So they're just coming here and perhaps structurally leading to the same economic problems associated with a decreasing population that you'd expect, right? And then the second response is, well, uh, what about those other countries, right? So, are we actually hurting those other countries because we're so attractive for immigrants that we're leading to brain drain to those countries? We're leading to their best and brightest leaving those countries. We're exacerbating global inequality to some extent by having the poorest countries send over their youngest and most ambitious people. So, what are your response to those two arguments?
So even if immigrants had zero kids in the United States, it's still beneficial because we have the immigrants themselves who are the additional workers, consumers, investors, and entrepreneurs who are here. So I don't think that it would be great if they had more kids, but there's still an addition of people here because of the immigrants just being here themselves, even if they don't have any other children who are here. In terms of the brain drain argument, I mean, it's just, even if it were true, I don't think it's true, but if it were true, it's totally irrelevant, right? What matters, I think, is human welfare, not the average income of like a geographical region, right? I mean, if the entire world could increase income by, let's say, like everybody living in Haiti, right, could increase their income by a factor of 10 by coming to the United States, which is about what it is. But Haiti's empty and doesn't have anybody in it. I mean, who cares? I mean, what's the problem? Like, right? You have Haitians who are doing great. They're just not in Haiti anymore. And so I just don't see the problem there in terms of that. But what we also do see is just on the ground. Most people who leave, who emigrate, tend to try to develop some skills before they immigrate so that they can be better off. And that has a spillover effect where not everybody who gains those skills leaves. So in places like the Philippines and South Africa, where there's like robust nursing programs, and people, if you get a nursing degree, you can come to the United States or the Great Britain. What you see is a lot of people end up getting these degrees and not leaving. So the net impact on human capital accumulation in a lot of poorer countries from immigration is actually positive. And that doesn't take into account the value of remittances. So over about $1 trillion a year are sent from immigrants in developing countries, from immigrants in developed countries to developing countries. So basically, in that way, what these countries are doing are exporting what they have in abundance, which is labor, and importing what they have that they don't have a lot of, which is capital and funds.
Well, I do take issue with, I think, the second part of your first argument, which was that, well, it seemed to be, well, who cares if these other countries are left without like as much skill and ambition as they otherwise would be. I mean, that is kind of a problem, right? If only for the selfish reason that developing good and robust trading partners would be an economic boon. That is a problem to some extent, but also just in a humanitarian sense. That you would hope that a policy that your country benefits from doesn't like proportionally hurt the country that you're interacting with, right? Hopefully, trade relations of humans and capital can be mutually beneficial.
Right. But if everybody from Haiti comes to the United States, we have zero trade with Haiti, but everybody's better off.
Well, no,
So,
because
right?
well,
Like in an extreme
yeah,
situation.
yeah, but I think that the extreme sort of neglects the reality, which is that the reality is there's a lot of Haitians that, because of personal circumstance, because of policy, just aren't able to come to the United States, right? And so they're left behind in effect. But then I guess your response would be, well, the remittances and the skill development, and like there is actually more mutual benefit than otherwise.
So Lant Pritchett, who's an economist, development economist, he works a bit on migration, says if there were global free migration, there would be some countries that are basically empty out. He calls them ghost countries. and a lot of like poor sub-Saharan African countries. Haiti would be another example. And I care about the incomes and wealth and productivity of individuals, and whether immigration pulls a lot of people out of poverty, and whether it pulls a country out of poverty. I mean, a country is um, an abstraction in a lot of ways. It's made up of a lot of people, and if those people get pulled out of poverty by leaving that country, then I don't know why we should care about that, right? It's just a piece of land. And what matters is the standard of living for these people, and what they do, right? I mean, virtually every Haitian, almost every Haitian who has gotten out of poverty has done so by leaving Haiti, because that place is just full of problems of, man-made problems, natural problems, and other problems. And the benefits are so great. It is about a tenfold increase in income by coming to the United States, and that's accounting for cost of living. That I find it very, I mean, it's just like perplexing to me. Like I don't know why we care about what happens to countries outside of the individuals in these countries. And if there's people left behind, they get remittances. A lot of people would come though, and not every country would empty out, right? Like Canada obviously wouldn't, Mexico wouldn't empty out, lots of countries wouldn't, right? But I just don't think that, and this might be a sort of an ethical argument, but the people in these countries, like, they don't owe anything to these countries. These are people who should be free to move where they want to move and to do what they want for themselves and their families. And if that's by leaving and that's what's good for them, then I say let them come.
Yeah. No, that makes some sense. I do get what you're saying, and I think that there is a stronger moral argument for allowing I mean, the right has labeled these people as economic refugees, right? Oh, they're just coming because they're so incredibly poor, and that's bad. And it's like, I don't know, that seems as good a reason to want to leave your country as any, if you ask me.
It
Yeah.
seems like the second best reason, right? I mean, the first best is probably like the government or somebody's trying to kill you, right? Okay, totally get it. I don't think, well, some conservatives are against that, right? But what's the I mean, trying to think about this. Somebody's trying to kill you, or you're in a situation where your lifespan due to a poor economy is going to be like years and years or maybe decades shorter than it otherwise would be, because you as a willing worker are not able to be productive in a country where the government is predatory, or it's riven by crime or civil war, or all these other problems that you didn't create. And you can go to a place where these problems don't exist, where they want to employ you, where they want to hire you, where they want to sell you things. It's mutually beneficial. It's a positive sum arrangement. What is the economic argument against that? And I don't think there is one. I mean, there are other arguments that people can make, other value judgments that people can make, right? But in terms of just pure economics, there's not a good argument against it from either the sending side or the receiving side.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. How do you sell a more liberal immigration scheme to someone who just doesn't like immigrants? Is it possible? How do you go about that?
No, there's always a lot of people who never want to buy. So you're not going to be able to sell to anybody, right? But I think there's a lot of reasonable people in the middle who have some concerns. And I think, speaking in the current sort of American context, if I may, I think the number one issue that's the difference between, say, the immigration system we have now and one that's, say, 3, 4, or 5 times bigger is the general perception of chaos. And there's a perception amongst Americans, and it's frequently correct, that there is chaos along the border with Mexico. The United States is basically the only developed country that borders a developing country. And we border a lot of them, basically. A lot of other ones border those other
Yeah.
developing countries, right?
Tell that
So
to
there's this.
Eastern Europe.
Well, there's not like a land border, right? In a lot of Eastern Europe. There are people who are coming from Syria, they're crossing the water. That's always more difficult, right? And soon you might have some Ukrainians and others
Sure.
who are coming in. But the difference in income between Romania
Singapore.
and
I'm sorry.
and,
I'm just thinking of
and Ukraine.
examples.
Yeah, well, another water border though.
Is Singapore not attached by land
It's
to?
not?
I mean,
I think there's a causeway constructed, right? But it's an island. But Malaysia is not like a super poor country. I think
Well, that's
Malaysia,
Malaysia is relatively developed. Yeah, you're right. But I'm just thinking
I
of
think
funny
per
examples.
capita,
Go on with your point. I didn't want to derail your point.
yeah, no worries. But I mean, it's certainly a huge difference um, in terms of this. And one of the and so what happens is you have a lot of illegal immigration along the border, and you have these pictures of border patrol agents arresting lots of people, and you have large like streams of people trying to cross, and that causes a perception of chaos. And when people view chaos, they do not want to liberalize. So my reaction as a libertarian, because I'm a weirdo, right, is that when I see chaos, I'm like, well, that's probably caused by a lot of distortionary government policies. And so liberalization is probably the key. And I think that when I take a look at drug markets and a lot of black markets in the United States and other aspects, and I see that when I see immigration. But when most people see chaos, the result is the reaction is they want to clamp down and crack down, and they want more enforcement. And that creates a catch 22 when basically more enforcement causes deeper black markets and it's more difficult to solve these problems. And that's basically the cycle that we've been in the United States for like 40 some years. It's this basically cycle of chaos, causes the public to freak out, causes a crackdown, which causes more chaos, which causes a greater freak out, etc. So one of the things I try to impress upon people, number one, is this chaos is caused by a U.S. immigration system that lets in almost nobody who wants to be able to come, who wants to come here. And so saying America's system is very restrictive and it causes a lot of chaos is basically the points that I try to make to people.
Well, how do you defend that point, right? Because I think that what a lot of people see is, oh, we let in 1 million or 2 million legal immigrants a year. There's however the heck many undocumented people. We accept however many refugee claims a year. Um, you know, you're saying the system is relatively restricted, but we have one of the most we have some of the most immigrants coming into our country, and I think I believe what you're saying. But how do you
Yeah,
respond
yeah,
to that?
yeah.
Because the data is so easy to pull from to refute that. How do you respond to that?
So I say, as a percentage of the population, the United States has very few immigrants, right? We let in a large number each year, but the United States is a huge country. So when you adjust for immigrant inflows as a percentage of the population, the US is in the bottom end of the OECD countries in terms of the immigrant inflow each year. I mean, a country like Switzerland, Canada, it's about 3 times greater annually. Australia, it's about 5 times greater. Switzerland is about 6 times greater. Pre-COVID, of course, 2019. Vastly greater legal immigrant inflows. And as a percentage of the population, all these countries have much larger immigrant populations as a percentage of the population in the United States. Canada is about 20%. Australia is about 30%. Switzerland's over 30%. And the United States is about 13.9%. So we have a proud, and the number of immigrants we let in annually today is the same number as it was 120 years ago, when the U.S. population was 75%, 70% smaller than it is currently.
Right. Well, I think that I think at that point it sort of circles, because then their argument would be, well, these Canadian immigrants or whatever are more developed, right? They're coming from Japan and China and stuff, whereas we're letting in, poor Hispanic people, right? I mean, that would be sort of the response. Switzerland, obviously, I mean, what the heck? They're getting all these European immigrants, and those are like the best immigrants, according to a lot of people. But obviously, we're letting in Hispanic people, right? So what's quick response to that, I guess.
So the U.S. immigration system is trending towards selecting more highly educated people on its own, just because the world is getting more skilled and educated on its own. And the US does have more family based immigration than these other countries, but a majority of immigrants in all of these countries come through the family based system. They're not skills based immigrants. That goes for Canada as well. The only country in the world where a majority of immigrants are through the skills based category is Japan. Every other country is majority family based. But what we do see is the labor market outcomes of immigrants in the United States are, controlling for initial educations, et cetera, coming to the United States, they do better than a lot of these other countries that try to select people who are higher skilled off the bat. And part of the reason is just the US immigration system unintentionally does select for people who have a lot of motivation. So, like Canadian immigrants, they do well, they do great, they do fine. Canada benefits a ton from immigration. But looking at the sort of upward mobility of immigrants in the Canadian system, it's lower than in the US system. So I think we do ourselves a disfavor when we talk about the US system because it's a lot more, we're much better at attracting people who are like the self motivated, where it's really difficult to measure their potential on paper, while these other systems try to look at paper
Well,
qualifications more.
but wouldn't the response to that be just, well, if we had open borders, if we had a more liberal immigration system, that self selection probably gets altered to some extent. To that at that point, we would probably have a less quality field of immigrants because everyone knows they can just come here.
We probably would, the average immigrant would probably decrease in quality if the legal immigration system increased by like a factor of 5 or 10, right? But one of the things we also need to realize is that, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when we essentially had these open immigration systems, is that, roughly half of them were temporary. They'd come for a couple of years, they go back home. And this is the pattern we see in the EU with a lot of immigrants from poor countries to a lot of the Western countries. A lot of them are temporary. They come for some years, they go back home. And allowing that sort of circular flow is something that the United States has been very good at for a long time. I mean, Italian immigrants, 60% or so of Italians went back to Italy in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the late 19th century, about 40% of British immigrants went back to the United Kingdom. A third of Finns went back to Finland. And you can, for Norway, about half of the Norwegian immigrants went back to Norway. So this is the thing, and it's not like they were losers or anything. Like they came here, they made a lot of money, they went back home. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think if we had a much more open immigration system, we'd see a lot more circular migration.
Do you think, and this is different from probably stuff that you've looked at before, but I think something that China does probably a bit better than we do in America, and I think it's one of the ways that a more xenophobic government can actually export their culture to a certain extent. Um, China has a ton of international students. I mean, if you work in any STEM department, I had a lot of close contact with the STEM department, at least of my university, and um, it's a huge portion of Chinese nationals that are on education visas that the government of China pays for, right? And so to an anti-immigration person, they might think that's crazy. Oh my God, this government's paying you to go and do scientific research in another country? That's crazy. But what are the benefits of programs like that? Do you think that's something that the government could actually serve a useful purpose in? Just what are your general thoughts? I think that's something that the U.S. could probably catch up on, but what are your thoughts?
So the US could catch up on in terms of subsidizing American students to study overseas, you
Well,
mean?
studying abroad or perhaps paying, immigrants have a lot of barriers when it comes to education and educating themselves in the country. For
Yeah.
instance, I knew a girl, I was speaking once to a university administrator. It was a policy issue, and it was a girl who had, she was an immigrant, so she was, as you mentioned, she was legally not allowed to work any other job besides her graduate school job, making $600 a month, right? And I asked the administrator I was talking with, I don't understand what this person is supposed to do. They're not allowed to work anywhere else. You're
Yeah.
only paying her 600 a month. She literally can only, she should sell drugs? Should she, become an under the table, car washer or something? I mean, what are her options, right? She has none because the policy makes it so. And so what do you think the US could do to export its own culture abroad? And what do you think it could do to make it perhaps easier for immigrants to come and study?
So, I mean, if we want to export our culture abroad, I think the best way to do that is to import a lot more students. And one of the ways to make that possible, right, is to allows students to work while they're going to school in the United States. And the thing is, the dirty secret about the student visa, of course, is a lot of them do work unlawfully, in
Right.
various different ways. Especially like in childcare, daycare, family, a lot of like family employment, but also in other occupations, right? I mean, it's not, but there's some enforcement, and it's not like universal by any means, but a lot of them do. And I just make that a lot easier and a lot more transparent. And number one, and on top of that, make it so that they're much more likely to get permanent lawful residence in the United States after they are done studying, so that they can, because that's one of the barriers. Is a lot of the reasons why people want to come to the U.S. It's because our universities are good and everything like that, of course. But another one of the big reasons is then they have a chance of being able to stay and work in the U.S. labor market. And if we make it possible for more of them to do so, or much more likely that they'll be able to do so, then we'll get a lot more people applying, not only from China, but from other countries around the world.
Yeah, and I think that's probably also a good response to like, we're letting these immigrants come here and be educated at a public university, but then they leave to go back to their own country. It's like, well, to a certain extent, that's probably a good diplomatic thing to do. You're giving them, in theory, a good impression of living in America and sending them back to their home country to tell all their friends. And then also, to a certain extent, they're probably heavily incentivized to stay here anyway, right? Because that's where their work is and their research is.
I mean, there are lots of economic incentives, but the policy tries to disincentivize them from staying. So, like, if you try to come to the United States on a student visa and you say you want to stay here permanently, they won't give you a visa because you can't have the intent to stay here permanently, which is just crazy, right? So you have to
Really?
show yeah, so you have to show strong ties in your home country. Like, it's not like you have to maintain those ties through family and bank accounts and everything like that. So you can't say those magic words like, I want to go to the United States and become American as a student. Like, you can't say that. They will not give you a visa. So the system does everything it can to force these people out. And the thing is about universities, right? Like that, the state universities, I think, is the clearest example, but they have numerous tiers of prices. So the lowest prices are for like in-state students. Out-of-state students who are Americans pay a higher price, and foreign students pay the highest price of all. And when it comes down to it, you take a look at the subsidization. The foreign students basically end up subsidizing other American students in a lot of these universities, which is one of the reasons why a lot of these universities like to admit so many foreign students, is because they could charge them higher fees.
Right. Yeah, and that makes some sense as well. Well, all right. I don't want to take up any more of your time. That was a pretty solid hour and 50, I would say, minus the technical difficulties, I guess, at the beginning, which we were both guilty of. Thanks for talking to me. Did you want to tell the audience, the people, anything that you're working on, anything that's worth checking out?
Sure. We're going to be putting out a paper in the next several months where we take a look at the fiscal impact of immigration in the United States. We were able to get a model from the National Academy of Sciences that they use to estimate the fiscal impact of immigration. And we were able to sort of combine that with a few other models that we had access to come up with sort of what we think is a better way to predict the impact of immigrants by age of arrival and education on the public finances of the US government. And so we'll be releasing that probably in the summer sometime. But it's 170 pages. And we'll be putting our code online as well. So you can mess around with us and let us know if we made any mistakes or if we should do things differently.
Okay. All right. Well, like I said, thanks for talking to me. This was really fun. Going from watching you on TV to talking to you was great. Frankly, I was surprised I just to those watching, I just sent Alex a Twitter DM. That's how all this all this started. So, um, yeah, but no, it was really good talking to you. It was a great conversation.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks a bunch for having me. I appreciate it.